Hi, I'm Rachel, and I'm here to do a quick recap of the Jewish-themed speculative fiction that I read for Sci-Fi September. I haven't scripted this video, so hopefully I won't ramble. Usually it's the opposite. So I'm going to start with the first one that I started, although technically I listened to it on audiobook, but I still have a physical copy of The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon. I call this the granddaddy book of Jewish alternative histories, although I've been thinking a bit about Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, which technically he wrote around the same time as this was written. But this one is thematically more similar to the types of alternative histories that I usually read, or I've read last year at least for Jewish alternative histories. This posits changes in history around the Holocaust, which leads to an alternative Jewish state other than the State of Israel. So in this book, Chabon heard about some U.S. idea that maybe they could section off part of Alaska for Jewish refugees in Europe before the Holocaust, actually. And so he takes that forward, and he has some refugees come before the Holocaust, more come during it, and then he decides that the fledgling State of Israel would fall to the Arab neighbors. And so there is no more Israel, there is no more Jewish state in the Middle East, so the only fully Jewish state is very Yiddish, and it's in Sitka, Alaska. And that's sort of an American territory. I thought of it a bit like Puerto Rico. It's not technically part of the States, but 60 years later, around the beginning of the 21st century, when Chabon was writing this book in real time, Sitka is about to be reclassed into the United States, and it's going to lose its Jewish flavor. And so we are coming at all of this backstory and history through the lens of a murder mystery, and seeing things through the eyes predominantly of policemen. The Yiddish Jewish Sitka police force, most of all, are going to be laid off within the next few months when Sitka becomes American again. So they're trying to wrap up some cases. And chief among them is something that happens right at the beginning of the book, where we have our stereotypical detective, the divorced, cynical, alcoholic Meyer Landsman, who is living in a seedy hotel, and one of his neighbors gets murdered. And it's a weird case. It's like not a lot of evidence, and it's, I guess, unusual for this sort of cold-blooded, strange thing to happen without any evidence of what went on. And beyond that, the higher-ups want to like make this a cold case almost immediately. So you know there's some skeletons in the closet, as it were, more than usual, I guess, for a murder case. And slowly but surely we get deeper into the plot and see how this murder is tied into broader elements about Sitka's future and the future of Jews, and what some nefarious parties want to do next when Sitka goes away, and what's going to happen to the Jewish world. And trying to be vague here anyway, don't want to give anything away. Obviously the crime genre is very plot driven and I have to say it is not my favorite genre, but I kind of dug how Chabon got into the voice of the crime genre, and then how he mixed in a lot of Yiddish into that. I think it was a high point of entry for a lot of people, but I know enough of Yiddish and of religious culture, which also plays a part a little bit, especially because we're with a Hasidic movement, an ultra-Orthodox movement, and go into them a little bit. So I had enough of a base knowledge to go along with all of that, and I enjoyed the tone. I enjoyed the characters more than I thought I would for this genre, although I don't feel like I was more interested in them than what Chabon put on the page. I didn't want anything more. I didn't really interact with them the way that I'd interact with characters who would interest me that extra degree. So, I mean, I'm trying to say that I still think that this genre, this crime genre, is not my thing. I would have preferred to explore the idea of a Jewish state in Alaska from a more literary perspective, probably. But I was surprised at how engaging I found this book to be. And I think a lot of people would find it relatively engaging if you can get past that cultural difference. I listened to it on audiobook, as I said, and I really was impressed with the narrator. I have to say, overall, I do think male narrators are really good. I really liked what he did with the female inflections. At least I thought they were more than decent, and the male inflections were fine and good, and it, you know, it was another element that I think brought me into the story and made me think of noir films. Not that I even know much about them, but it's this whole detective genre, and I have to say all of the characters were generally kind of stereotypical in their makeup, but it made me enjoy the experience all the more. And at the end of the discs in the audiobook, there was a quick interview with Chabon himself, and he talked about his inspiration for writing this, that he had found a Yiddish phrase book somewhere, and it got him thinking, because Yiddish is a language in Eastern European Ashkenazi Judaism, but it's never been like a national language of any sort. So he's thinking of these phrase books as go to this country and speak the language, and he's like, but you can't really do that in Yiddish. There is no place where you can, where it's like the formal official language. And he wrote an article about it, and he upset some Yiddishists, because there are some hardcore Yiddishists who are trying to bring this language back into a little bit of prominence. And it does seem like Chabon, I don't know, I think even he admitted to the fact that his article was a little half-baked, and it's just basically his own random thoughts, and he didn't do any research into the writers or into the culture of Yiddishists. So part of the reason he wrote this book was sort of to flip the bird to the people who who spoke against his article, and then, you know, that makes me roll my eyes a little bit. I don't know, I know a couple of things about Chabon as a person that kind of makes me eye-rolly, although I shouldn't hold that against his fiction. And another thing he did want to do and succeeded at is thought up a country, basically, where Yiddish was the official language, and what it would look like, at least in a police procedural way. I really do feel like out of all of the Jewish alternative histories that I've read, I don't even know if it's my favorite. I really did like Judenstadt a lot, that I read last year, but I do feel like this one, he captures a voice and a tone that makes this seem more real, and something that I can at least believe in for the duration of the book, a little more than I could some other ones. This next book is my favorite of the three that I read, and my favorite book that I read all month. This is He, She, and It by Marge Piercy. It is a 1991 sci-fi novel. It's cyberpunk, it's called. I don't know if that term is really used all that much anymore, or if it's used for books anymore. I feel like maybe we just go straight into calling this a dystopia. Because it takes place in the mid-21st century, around 2059. And using all those 90s buzzwords, we're talking about the ozone layer being severely compromised. Governments have shut down. There's been massive famines and warfare that's come out of the world being a much more dangerous place to live. So, you know, world governments are down, and the earth is being controlled by like 24 multis, which are humongous corporations that kind of control the vast majority of wealth, and they have most of the technological goods to keep people safe. And then there are some free towns that also have some protection so that people can live in relative safety and security. And then I think a lot of the rest of the world, or at least Piercy talks about Africa and Asia a bit, are pretty much inhospitable, but there's a vast part of North America called the Glop, which is it's short for something I can't exactly remember, but basically it's kind of a no man's land where people are less protected, certainly a lot more poor, and it's a sort of gang run and just a very dangerous place to live, where the majority of people apparently live, although this book doesn't really go directly into a lot of those characters. We are mostly with characters who have access to the multis and to the free towns, or at least our main character is named Shira Shipman. And she grew up in a free town called Tikva, which is Hebrew for hope, and then she moved to a multi-YS where she works as some sort of techie, and marries a man named Josh, who is the child of refugees from Israel, which is a place that in this world was blown up by radioactive activity before the book begins, and it's inhospitable, and then his parents were killed in anti-Jewish riots because the radioactive stuff happened during something called like the 2 Weeks War, which was a religious geographical war in that area. So Jews in general are back to being exiled, and in particular because Piercy imagines the Maltese as not only corporate and bureaucratic, but very dismissive of any sort of minority culture. And Josh and Shira live as conversos, which is a term from the Spanish Inquisition for Jews that lived as Jews in secret for fear of being found out and killed, but they didn't want to, actually let go of their traditions. So that's more or less what Josh and Shira are doing. The corporation is kind of aware that they have some weird Jewish customs that they're judged for, but for the most part they're living in secret. They undergo a pretty bitter divorce, and marriage in this corporation is seen as like a 10-year contract, which may or may not be renewed, and Josh gets custody of their son Ari because he has like a higher pay grade, and Shira is pretty much left in the lurch. Josh is a very unlikable character, although I really like that there's a bit of explanation that he's believably unlikable. And so Shira goes home to Tikva, where a old family friend who is dealing in cybernetics with cyborgs wants her to help with the behavioral programming of a cyborg that he's created called Yod, which is the 10th Hebrew letter, so the 10th experiment into making a very human robot, which is something that in this world is not technically legal. It's not seen as ethical for robots to be too human, but it's something that is very lucrative, and for, I guess, obvious reasons, about infiltrating societies with a robot or having superhuman speed, but also like an emotional component. But anyway, a lot of this novel does have to deal with the ethical issues of creating a robot with human emotions and human sensibilities, who sees himself or itself as human. And then Piercy takes that a step further and has a subplot that deals with the legend of the Golem, which is a medieval legend from Prague, where the ghetto in Prague during that time was inundated with violent anti-Semitic attacks, sort of day-to-day stuff, which was more 1 or 2 people getting hurt or killed, and then like every generation or so, like massive attacks where pogroms, they're called, where the Christian populace would band together and really storm the town and kill a lot of people. And afterwards, then the Jews would be forced to pay for the expenses and, anti-Semitism, so forth. And so, but during all of this, a rabbi and his disciples use the Kabbalah to build a man out of clay who is like a superhero sort of man, but at the same time he's also dealing with the issues that he's feeling human, that he's not just a mindless killing machine. He has human impulses, and so it goes into those ethical issues. And so Piercy's drawing an allegory between these two stories. And it also draws into her characters, because one of the other characters is telling Yod this story to help him with his own personal dilemmas. And this is really a very character-driven story. I feel like Shira is very well developed. She has the things that drive her are her relationships with other people. She comes home. She's had this very intense relationship when she was a teenager with a neighbor called Gotti, who's back in town, and Gotti's a bit of a playboy, and he is the son of the man who she works for, and so we get into the tense relationship between father and son. And so there's just and there's other characters as well that we really get nice details into primary and secondary characters, and I really feel like for all this is an action-packed sci-fi adventure, because YS is aware of Shira's activities, making a cyborg, and they want the cyborg, and so there's action and adventure and intrigue, but there's also a lot of character stuff and character growth and character development, and so that's really what drew me so much into the story. And by the end of it, I was really emotional about the relationships and the issues, and I really was surprised and impressed by this 1990s novel. You know, another thing they have in here, Piercy has, is the net, like, which is like the internet, except that she sees it as, you know, and I think we still see it in a lot of sci-fi, as a place where you can sort of project yourself into sort of a metaphysical place, and so you see the net as a place you can walk around in and grab data that way. But she called it in a lot of ways about how information heavy the future is, or the present is. I mean, she called how the information data is a major resource nowadays. It has a lot of power over all of us, and danger in terms of who has access to what information data, Facebook. And then of course we have climate change. You know, some of the verbiage has changed, but you know, there's massive weather problems that they talk about in sort of passing in the book, and it made me think a lot about the hurricanes that you know, are coming up against the United States and other places of late. So I feel like she had some very prescient thoughts about the world building, and then I thought she did some great stuff with these human characters, where society's changed a bit, but humans remain very human. So yeah, this was my favorite book of the month, and I would heartily recommend it. And finally, I just finished this one. I'm still giggling about the title. This is Jews versus Aliens. It's a collection of short stories by 10 authors. It's edited by Lavi Tidhar and Rebecca Levine. I think I'm laughing a little less now that I've actually read the stories and gotten a concept of what this collection is all about. My very silly little draw to the story is that I love spacefaring science fiction. I love Jewish themes. I wanted to read stories about Jews in space, but a lot of these stories aren't about Jews in space. There's I think only one technically where they're in space. Some are about futuristic alien contact. A lot of them have a comedic bent, which, you know, I kind of appreciate, but at the same time, I love serious stories. I'm too serious for my own good, but there's some serious stuff in here too. But there's a wide variety of stories. I mean, more than I would have thought of on my own, although it makes me think that I should have thought of it on my own. There's a biblical story in here, which imagines the problems in biblical Sodom having extraterrestrial influences in them. There's a lot of stories that take place in Russian history, in the Pale of Settlement, where the Jews lived under the Russian Empire, and also then going into the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. There's stories that take place around that. There's a lot of religion that comes into this, which takes alien contact stuff from the Talmud. There's unusually formatted stories, like epistles in here, like, you know, back and forth interactions between the protagonist and a secondary character. A couple that particularly stick out to me. There's one by Naomi Alderman, who BookTube will know better for winning the Women's Prize for her novel The Power. Her story is one of those back and forth transcripts between an alien converting to Judaism and someone interviewing about why would you do this. I liked it because Alderman thought of the idea of unusual genders, like, you know, that an alien wouldn't just be male or female the way we are, but this one has 4 genders. But the ending is so disquieting, and I think in a great way, because we learn that this alien species committed genocide against a small fraction of their populace, and this alien is trying to join Judaism because he or she is looking for forgiveness, and it just has those Holocaust undertones to it, and it's creepy in that way. And that's the thing about a lot of these stories, is that, you know, we're saying they're about aliens, but like all science fiction, it's really mostly about the human condition. And that's what I would say is the major theme of what I think is the best story in this collection, and from a thematic literary point of view. It's called The Farm by Ilana Gomel, and it's one of those stories that's taking place during the Russian Revolution, but the revolution is halted by the fact that some zombie-like aliens have cropped up called the Eaters, and, you know, they're eating people. And so our protagonist is this assimilated Jewish boy named Yaakov, a socialist boy named Yaakov, who is trying to fight them off. But then we get into the backstory of how these aliens came to be, and it harkens again to the human condition, about who we are as people and the monsters we create. And Yaakov is such a flawed character, but you identify with him, or at least I think Jewish characters would, Jewish readers I think would identify with him a bit. So it's a lot about turning that mirror inward about our own flaws. But my favorite short story is one of the only ones that has a female protagonist. I mean, sheesh, there's a lot of female writers in this, but not a lot of female protagonists. It's called On the Matter of Miraz by Rosanne Rabinowitz, and I hope that I pronounced that Hebrew correctly. Miraz is a place that's referenced in the Book of Judges, and in the Talmud, rabbis are saying that it was probably an alien planet. And so that comes to pass in this story, which takes place during the tail end of the Russian Empire, and we're in this small town in the Pale of the Settlement, which is beset by these pogroms, these violent pogroms. And we have these two characters, these two men who are yeshiva students who are studying the Talmud and the story of Miraz. And then we have one of their sisters, Reisel, who has turned assimilated into a Jewish Bundist, who is someone who believes in fighting back against the pogromists, and she also is a socialist and sees herself as part of the working class and the worker party. But she wants to take part in contacting these aliens because the story has to do with prophecy and to do with getting help against the pogromists, and she gets linked up to the biblical character of Deborah. And again, I felt like this story was a little bit longer for a short story, but I feel like Rabinowitz packed a huge punch in it. Like there's just a lot of layers of characterization and of backstory, and I just found it very absorbing. And again, like the Yiddish Policemen's Union, and probably he, she, it as well, I don't know how applicable or easy access this would be. I mean, for non-Jewish readers, I would hope maybe the human themes would surpass the fact that you might need to get a dictionary out or an encyclopedia for some of the words and customs. Reading these books kind of made me, as a Jewish reader, feel like an alien when I would then go onto Goodreads and people would be saying, what the hell are they talking about? But, and it also made me think of the fact that I'm hoping to read other fiction that is beyond the Jewish experience that will teach me about other cultures. Extraterrestrial, alien, or otherwise. So that about covers it for me now. Next on my docket for October reading, I am going back to my Sammy Rohr Prize for Emerging Jewish Writers in Nonfiction. For the 2014 year, I have 3 books coming to me for me to read. I also have a couple of science fiction books that I didn't get to in Sci-Fi September that I hope to be actually getting to now. And I still have to finish this book, this kindly gift from Steve Donahue, which I started on Yom Kippur and then put aside, and now I think is next on the agenda for finishing ASAP. So I hope your own reading plans are going well and you're having a swell start to October. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.